Picture two piles sitting on the same patch of seafloor. One is a heap of dead, broken oyster shells, scraped off dinner plates and dumped out of a 5-gallon bucket, gray and lifeless and smelling faintly of low tide. The other looks almost identical at first glance until you notice it's moving, tiny shapes clinging to every surface, filtering the water around them, slowly cementing themselves into a solid, living wall of stone. Give that second pile a few years, and it will start doing something genuinely remarkable. It will filter tens of thousands of gallons of water a day, break the force of incoming storm waves before they ever reach the shoreline, and become home to more species than almost any other habitat in the entire estuary. The strange part is, both piles started out exactly the same way, as garbage, and the only thing standing between a heap of restaurant trash and a living reef is something Florida has spent close to 2 decades quietly figuring out, one truckload of recycled shell at a time. There's no single dramatic moment in this story, no one offshore dumping event that left marine biologists stunned overnight. What's actually happening along Florida's coastline is slower, less cinematic, and once you understand what's really going on, considerably more impressive. It's the story of an entire state slowly learning to stop throwing away the one material its damaged coastline needs most. Historic oyster populations have declined by 85% or more, the cumulative result of over a century of overharvesting, industrial pollution, dredging for shipping channels, and increasingly powerful storms, churning up sediment that smothers young reefs before they can establish themselves. Nowhere is that collapse more visible than Appalachicola Bay, a stretch of Florida's panhandle coastline that once supplied as much as 90% of the entire state's oyster harvest. The fishery there was declared a federal disaster in 2013 after landings cratered. And despite years of restoration attempts, the population kept sliding until 2020, when Florida wildlife officials made the almost unthinkable decision to shut the bay's wild oyster harvest down entirely for 5 years, a complete closure of a fishery that had defined an entire regional economy and culture for generations. That collapse matters, for reasons that go well beyond the seafood industry, because oysters aren't just a food source. They're one of the hardest working organisms in any coastal ecosystem. And they have been central to life along Florida's coast for far longer than any restaurant has existed. Indigenous communities along Florida's coastline were harvesting and consuming oysters thousands of years before European contact. Villages and ceremonial sites on top of. Long before anyone used the word ecosystem services, coastal communities understood, in a very direct and physical way, just how much a healthy oyster population was worth. A single adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a single day, pulling out excess nutrients, algae, sediment, and even bacteria as it feeds, acting as a living water treatment system running continuously for free 24 hours a day. A healthy reef made up of millions of oysters can process an entire estuary's worth of water multiple times over in the course of a single day. On top of that, oyster reefs function as natural breakwaters. Studies conducted in the Gulf of Mexico have found that oyster reefs can reduce incoming wave energy by anywhere from 76 to 99%, absorbing the force of storm surge and boat wakes before they ever reach the marsh grasses and shorelines behind them. Lose the reef, and you don't just lose the oysters. You lose the water filtration, the storm buffer, and the foundation habitat that supports juvenile fish, crabs, and dozens of other species that depend on reef structure to survive. So if oyster reefs matter this much, and Florida has lost the overwhelming majority of its historic reefs, the obvious next question is why rebuilding them turns out to be so difficult. The answer comes down to a strange, specific biological preference that oyster larvae have, one that creates a genuine bottleneck in the restoration process. When oysters spawn, generally from late spring through fall as water temperatures and salinity rise, fertilized eggs develop into free-swimming larvae over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks, drifting through the water column carried by currents and tides, growing a tiny foot-like appendage they use to feel out the seafloor for somewhere to settle. And when that moment comes, oyster larvae overwhelmingly prefer to attach to one specific surface above almost anything else available to them, other oyster shell. Something about the exact texture and the chemical cues given off by old, weathered shell triggers a far stronger settlement response than rock, concrete, or any artificial substitute. Scientists have tried, a kind of biological homing signal passed down through millions of years of oysters settling on the remains of the oysters that came before them. Once a larva finds a suitable shell and presses itself down, it secretes a natural cement and permanently glues itself in place, never to move again for the rest of its life. At that early stage, it's called spat, and it begins the slow process of growing into an adult oyster, becoming, in turn, the next surface that future generations of larvae will settle onto. That single biological quirk explains the entire shape of Florida's restoration strategy. The most effective way to rebuild a reef isn't to dump rocks or concrete into the water and hope for the best, although both have been tried with some success. It's to get as much real weathered oyster shell back into the water as possible, because shell recruits new spat more effectively than almost anything else available. And that creates an uncomfortable irony at the heart of the entire problem. The same oyster harvesting industry that depends on healthy reefs has, for most of its history, been removing the exact material those reefs need to regenerate. For decades, the market shifted increasingly toward shucked, pre-shelled oysters sold to restaurants and retailers, meaning the shell itself, once an automatic byproduct that stayed somewhere near the water, increasingly ended up sealed in garbage bags and trucked off to landfills hundreds of miles from any coastline, permanently removing it from the marine environment instead of returning it to the water, where new generations of oysters could have used it as a foundation. It's a strange kind of self-defeating cycle, an industry slowly consuming the very infrastructure it depends on to keep existing, one shucked shell at a time, with nobody intending any harm and almost nobody noticing until the reefs themselves started disappearing. Fixing that broken loop is exactly what Florida's network of oyster shell recycling programs has spent the better part of 2 decades building, restaurant by restaurant, bucket by bucket. The process itself is refreshingly low-tech, the kind of system that runs on dump trucks and volunteer labor rather than any kind of advanced technology. Participating restaurants set aside used shells in dedicated collection bins rather than throwing them in the trash, often as simple as placing a bucket near the dish pit and swapping it out once it fills. Volunteers or partner organizations pick those shells up on a regular schedule, sometimes several times a week, and transport them to a curing site, often donated public land near the coast, county property, a corner of a preserve, sometimes just an open lot near the water. There, the shells sit outdoors for a minimum of 3 months in Florida's climate, exposed to sun, rain, and scavenging insects and birds that pick off any remaining tissue, a process that looks, frankly, a little unglamorous up close. Mounds of shell baking in the heat, while nature does the dirty work of cleaning them. But that curing period is essential, eliminating harmful bacteria that could otherwise be introduced back into the water, and it's a step every reputable program follows without exception. Only after curing is complete does the shell get loaded back onto trucks or barges and deployed at carefully selected restoration sites, where it's spread across the bottom or packed into mesh bags, reef balls, or wire cages called gabions, creating exactly the kind of hard, textured surface oyster larvae are searching for the moment they're ready to settle. These programs exist in cities and counties up and down Florida's coastline, and while none of them individually move anywhere close to 500,000 tons in a single dramatic event, their combined, sustained effort over years adds up to something genuinely significant. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection has partnered with Keep Pensacola Beautiful since 2011, collecting shell from area restaurants to rebuild reefs in the Pensacola Bay system, or in a body of water that lost more than 90% of its commercially harvestable oysters to a catastrophic pollution-driven die-off back in the early 1970s. In Manatee County, a program that started with just 3 restaurant partners and a single donated trailer has grown into a partnership backed by a $950,000 state grant. Now focused on rebuilding reefs along the Manatee River, a waterway so thick with oysters in the early 1800s that settlers simply called it the Oyster River. On Florida's Atlantic coast, the Florida Oceanographic Society's recycling program has helped restore nearly 60,000 square feet of reef in the St. Lucie Estuary and Indian River Lagoon, powered by more than 2,400 volunteers, donating over 6,000 hours of labor. The Coastal Conservation Association of Florida alone reported deploying over 150 tons of recycled shell in 2025, restoring 38 separate reef sites and more than 4 miles of shoreline in a single year. None of these numbers are flashy on their own. Stacked together, year after year, county after county, they represent a real, ongoing, statewide effort that's been quietly running far longer and far more carefully than any single dramatic headline could capture. This isn't unique to Florida either, which helps put the scale of the real effort in perspective. Across the wider Gulf Coast, 5 major oyster recycling programs working together have collectively recycled millions of tons of shell over the years. And in 2024, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration awarded $5 million specifically to expand that network across Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, and Texas. In Alabama, the Coastal Foundation alone has recovered 22.6 million individual shells since 2016 through partnerships with local restaurants. In Louisiana, volunteers and members of the Pointe Ocean tribe used 200 tons of bagged recycled shell to armor 400 feet of shoreline, protecting an ancient burial mound, one of more than 800 historic mounds along that coast, some older than the Egyptian pyramids, now threatened by rising water. Seen against that backdrop, Florida's own patchwork of city, county, and nonprofit programs isn't an isolated curiosity. It's one piece of a coordinated multi-state effort to close a supply chain that had been broken for the better part of a century, where shucked shell went into a landfill instead of back into the water that needed it. Then there's Appalachicola Bay itself, the site of the most severe collapse and, fittingly, the focus of some of the most ambitious restoration work currently underway. For generations, the small fishing town of Appalachicola built its entire identity and economy around the bay's oysters, supplying restaurants and seafood markets across the country and supporting a way of life passed down through families of oystermen working the bay by hand, using long-handled tongs from small boats the same way their grandparents had. Watching that fishery collapse wasn't just an economic blow, it was the loss of a culture built directly on top of a healthy reef system, which makes the restoration effort there carry a weight the other programs don't quite have. With the wild fishery closed and a small but dedicated recycling program run through Oyster Corps, part of the AmeriCorps Conservation Network, collecting what shell it can from the limited local restaurant base, Florida is now preparing to launch large-scale restoration efforts using limestone substrate alongside bare shell and what's called spat on shell, oyster larvae deliberately raised in a hatchery and attached to shell before deployment, giving the reef a running head start rather than waiting entirely on wild settlement. Restoring the single bay at meaningful scale is estimated to require placing roughly an inch of shell material across 90 acres of reef, an amount of material that gives you a real sense of just how much shell genuine large-scale reef recovery actually demands, and why every restaurant bucket and every curing pile matters as much as it does, even in a town that, for now, can't legally harvest a single wild oyster from the bay it's spent generations depending on. Once shell actually makes it back into the water, the transformation from garbage to habitat happens faster than you might expect. Researchers monitoring spat settlement in Florida, estuaries have found that larvae can begin attaching to fresh substrate within weeks of deployment, with settlement activity peaking seasonally, typically smaller pulses in spring, and a much larger surge around September. At one restoration site near Marineland on Florida's northeast coast, biodegradable reef modules, built partly from recycled shell, recruited between 150 and 200 new, spat each within just 4 months of being placed in the water. Further south in Charlotte Harbor, the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation built an entirely new 3-acre oyster reef, after research showed that areas with strong larval abundance responded especially well to additional substrate. Exactly the kind of evidence-based, site-specific approach that's come to define how these programs operate today. And on Florida's Atlantic coast, in Brevard County's Indian River Lagoon, a community oyster gardening program has residents grow young, spat off their own docks for 6 months to 9 months before transferring them to restoration sites. During organized events, locals have started calling Homecoming, a program that has already produced more than 500,000 juvenile oysters destined for reef construction. Multiply that kind of recruitment across an entire reef built from tons of recycled shell, and you start to understand how a restoration site can go from an empty stretch of bare bottom to a functioning, self-sustaining reef structure within a handful of years, with each new generation of oysters cementing itself onto the shells of the generation before it, building the reef both outward and upward the same way it would have happened naturally before the original reefs were lost. What makes this entire effort worth paying attention to isn't a single dramatic offshore dumping event that left scientists scrambling for answers. It's the opposite. It's hundreds of small, unglamorous, carefully coordinated actions. A restaurant setting aside a bucket instead of a dumpster, a handful of volunteers hauling shell to a curing pile on a Saturday morning, Ottawa County government securing a grant to expand a pilot program that started with 3 local restaurants, repeated patiently across 2 decades and dozens of communities along Florida's coastline. There was no single moment when 500,000 tons of shell went into the water and the ocean responded with something nobody expected. There were, instead, thousands of smaller moments, each one slightly improving the odds that the next generation of oyster larvae would have somewhere real to land, none of them individually newsworthy, all of them adding up to a genuine, measurable shift in how much living reef now exists along stretches of coastline that had nearly lost it entirely. That's also, in its own way, the most encouraging part of the whole story. Rebuilding an ecosystem this badly damaged doesn't require a single miracle intervention or some massive, improbable event dramatic enough to make headlines on its own. It requires understanding one very specific, very solvable piece of biology, that oyster larvae need old shell to settle on. C, and then organizing enough people, restaurants, volunteers, scientists, and government agencies to consistently supply it, year after year, restaurant bucket by restaurant bucket, until the reefs that took a century to destroy have a real chance of slowly, patiently coming back. No single agency, university, or nonprofit could pull this off alone, and none of them are trying to see. It's working precisely because it doesn't depend on any one dramatic breakthrough, just a network of ordinary people deciding, repeatedly, that a pile of old shell is worth more in the water than it ever was in a landfill. If stories like this are the kind that actually keep you watching, the real ones, where patient, unglamorous science quietly turns garbage back into a living ecosystem, hit subscribe so the next one finds you, and pass this along to anyone who's ever finished a plate of oysters without thinking twice about where the shells went next.